Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to Sprint 20 reporting workshop. It is hard to believe that it has been 10 years since we started Software Center. And I wanted to really welcome all of you to this opening presentation. We are not going to spend the whole day talking about what happened over the last 10 years and what we hope will happen in the next 10 years. Of course, the focus is on the content that we have constantly been focusing on and working with in Software Center over the last 10 years. I believe that that's one of the key reasons for our success, that we focus a lot on what is relevant for the companies at hand. But I did want to spend a few minutes on looking back and giving a bit of a perspective of what has happened over the last 10 years. So if you could share the slides by any chance, thank you very much. So just a second, and then we'll have the slides up. Thank you very much. Good. So as I mentioned, it is hard to believe that it has been 20 sprints that we have so far conducted within Software Center. And I realize that although I think that almost all of you know who I am, I will very briefly mention that my name is Jan Bosch. I am Director of Software Center and also a professor here at Chalmers University of Technology. What I wanted to do is to spend a minute on looking back on what was the reason that Software Center was started. And about 10, 12 years ago, if I remember correctly, maybe it's even more, Mark Andreessen, you I'm sure all know from Andreessen Horowitz, the VC company, and the browser that he built in the very beginning, wrote an op-ed in what I think was the New York Times, in which he mentioned software is eating the world, is what he titled the thing. What he basically described is that basically every business, everything that he saw happen was starting to become driven by software rather than by any of the other technologies that were up to that point maybe the key differentiators. And that led to the situation where some of the senior leaders of some of the companies that were the founding members of Software Center connected with what was then the president of Chalmers, Karin Markides, and asked her to look into establishing a center that would help the companies in the region to become better at software engineering. And for those of you that remember that we started with 4 companies, Ericsson, Volvo Trucks, AB Volvo, Volvo Cars, and Saab. And we started with 2 universities, Chalmers and the University of Gothenburg. 10 years later, Software Center today consists of 16 companies, and after Tuesday we may actually be 17 companies, and we are 5 universities. And I think that that's really a wonderful state to be in. And I really want to thank both the founding members and all the member companies for being members of Software Center, industrial members. And of course, we also are grateful for all the support from the universities that we're getting, because we need both. Yeah? It takes 2 to tango is what the saying is. But that really is what is the situation. What is also important is that we started our mission in 2011 with the notion of significantly improving the software engineering capability of the European, and at that point I think it even was the Swedish software intensive industry. And over the years we have actually broadened our scope from just software engineering to digitalization at large. So that is what I think is quite an evolution that we've seen, and we have also broadened our scope from just Sweden to Europe as a whole. So we have companies from Germany such as Siemens and Bosch. We have companies from Finland such as Wärtsilä. We have companies from Denmark such as Dive and Grundfos. And of course we still have, one could claim we even have an American company as Jeppesen, which is part of Boeing, is part of Software Center, but we predominantly work with the Gothenburg site then. So I've been very, very proud and happy to see how things have evolved. And if we look at what happened over the last 10 years, we started, as I mentioned, with 6 partners. We are today 21 partners, and soon we will be 22 partners. We started with 3 research projects, which I think had maybe 1 or 1.5 researchers involved in them. We're now at 20 projects, or around 20 projects. We started with 4 researchers. We are now at around 30 researchers. I have had a really hard time keeping track of the number of publications that we have pushed out over the last 10 years. But I think it's a safe bet that we at least have published 500 or more publications. At least myself, I think I'm somewhere in the 300 range. And if you look into funding, we are closing in on the 100 million SEK over the last 10 years that between the companies and universities we have invested in research in software engineering and digitalization. If we look at a model that was developed in the first year of Software Center that many of you have worked on, the Stairway to Heaven model, I think it's interesting to see where were the companies in 2011. And if I remember things, everyone at that point was working on transitioning from traditional development to becoming agile. Maybe Ericsson was a little bit ahead and already starting to focus on continuous integration, but by and large the Software Center companies were looking into R&D, how do we make the R&D organization go agile? Over the years we've seen that the focus has constantly shifted. I think that almost, well, basically all companies in the Software Center are now agile. They have worked very, very hard on getting continuous integration and continuous testing in place. And what I now see is that most of the companies are in different shapes and forms moving towards continuous deployment. And continuous deployment, as all of you are aware of, means that we are releasing software at least at the same frequency as our sprints, even though it may not exactly be the software at the end of the current sprint that goes live at the end of that sprint. And most companies are working towards getting there. Some of the companies, such as Ericsson, are already there and are looking into the next stage. And what we can see is that some of the companies in Software Center have started to look into the next topic as well, which is where we use R&D as an innovation system, meaning that we run things such as A/B testing in the context of the products that we put out in the field. And as you look at some of that, some of you know that, for instance, Volvo Cars is actively working with A/B testing, and also other companies within the Software Center are actively working on more experimental approaches towards developing software. One of the models that I think has been quite helpful for us to reason about what is happening in software engineering is what we've called the holistic DevOps model. And I think that some of you may have already seen this, but what is important here is that we distinguish between 3 different types of development. The first type of development is what we call requirements-driven development. We don't think that that type of development will go away. Typically this means you have a set of requirements, you have a specification, and what you're basically doing is you're developing or conducting your development in response to those requirements. And those are things like, what we see there happen is that regulatory features, features where you need to reach competitive parity, commodity features, those will be types of development that will continue to happen even in the future, we believe. There is a second type of development, though, that is quite important. This is where you have what we call outcome or data-driven development. So rather than saying, here is a specification, please build according to the specification, we now ask development teams to focus on a specific KPI, some key performance indicator. In the online world, this can be conversion. In communications, this can be bandwidth or throughput or any other metric. In other companies, this may be fuel efficiency or something like that. And the development team, rather than being told what to build, is focusing on what are different ways in which we can perhaps improve this KPI that we're asked to improve, without breaking or negatively affecting any of the other KPIs. And then we typically move towards things like A/B testing or other more experimental approaches where you do not necessarily know, or it's very hard to predict what the impact of that development will actually be. And this can be used very nicely for very innovative functionality, where you actually don't know if the functionality will have the outcome that you're looking for, but what you try to do is you try to experiment and figure out what works and what doesn't work. The third type of development is what we refer to as AI-driven development. In AI-driven development, we are focusing on, we have a large data set, typically it's labeled data. We develop machine learning or deep learning models in order to train with that labeled data. And once we have these models well trained, we can then deploy them in our systems and use them to improve the behavior or functionality of our systems. Here we typically focus on minimizing prediction errors, so we look at F1 scores, accuracy, recall, those kind of metrics. It's typically a situation where it is hard to, in an algorithmic way, come up with a proper solution. So what we do instead is we use the data to train the model and use the model in practice. What is important to understand, though, is that continuous deployment, or DevOps, if you want, is not just something that the traditional requirements-driven or the outcome-driven development is focusing on. Also, the machine learning models are going through the same DevOps or MLOps kind of iterations that we're looking for. So every component in the system, whether it's built by AI or it's built by software, will be subject to continuous deployment and will at the same time generate behavioral data that allows us to monitor and log and understand if the outcomes that we're looking to accomplish are actually being achieved or not. If you want to broaden the scope a little bit, I was trying to give a bit of a feel for the reach or the width of the publications or of the work that we're currently conducting in Software Center. So it's clear that if you look at the bottom of the figure that you're now looking at, the product upgrade dimension, it's very obvious that we have been working on how do you work with software, how do you work with updating of software, how do you build software in such a way that you can continuously add value to customers, which I think is one of the key shifts that we see currently happening. So if you look at the product upgrade dimension, you see that we initially sold the product as is, then we move towards reactive software updates, then we move to proactive and continuous software updates, and then I think that this is one of the things that we're going to be seeing in the coming 5 to 10 years within Software Center. We do not limit the upgrades anymore to what's software only, but we even start to look for ways in which we can periodically upgrade electronics and maybe the mechanics in our systems in order to be able to continuously deliver value to our customers. And then finally, there's of course, when we have a fully digitalized offering, where the customer doesn't really care anymore about what is the physical instance of the product that I have. I basically care about what that thing actually does for me. Yeah? So some of you, I've been talking about my new mobile phone that I got recently, a new iPhone. To be honest, there is really not a real difference between my old iPhone and my new iPhone, except that it's a little faster and it has a little bit better camera and a few other things. But basically, the experience is identical to my old iPhone, and I think that that's what we're going to be seeing a lot going forward in our industry. If we also, or in the different industries that of course represented here in Software Center, if we look at the business model, that's perhaps an area where one would initially perhaps not expect Software Center to work actively, but we are actually looking into that because we see that the business model that you have drives so many of the questions on the R&D side, because anything around how you architect your systems to how you develop your systems is actually driven by the business model and the business strategy that you have. And also because in my experience, it is actually the R&D organization that sets the real business strategy for the company, because the R&D organization often takes quite an extended period of time to realize the changes or improvements that they want to accomplish. And in order to, and by doing that, they basically make certain business strategies very difficult to accomplish and other business strategies very easy to accomplish. So in practice, it is actually in many companies, the R&D organization that sets the real business strategy for the company. And if we dare see what is happening, we see that of course many of the companies, and this is still a business model that is used a lot, we sell traditional product sales, So typically the focus is on the mechanical product or the electronics product. Then we see that companies move to products as a service. Then we see that the companies are starting to move, and many of you are doing that, onto complementary services around products. Then we see that companies are moving towards customer KPI-based business models. So for instance, I agree with my customer on what are the KPIs that you actually care about. Can we find a business model where I get paid based on my systems and my company helping you accomplish the KPIs that you care about? And then finally we move towards a multi-sided ecosystem, which is still a bit far out, but I think something that will become important in the coming 10 years, where we focus on the data, especially the data generated from our primary customer base, being monetized and used by other stakeholders that perhaps initially have nothing to do with our initial product. And that then leads, and I will speed up a little bit to give Eric a good bit of time, but I mean, then we move towards the data exploitation dimension, where initially data was mostly used for quality assurance and diagnostics. And actually we've had several discussions with companies in the software center where people were struggling to derive business relevant insights from data that was generated for quality assurance and diagnostics, and that is really difficult. Then we move towards data for product performance, not just is the product performing according to the specification, but am I improving different KPIs of the product that I care about? Then I move to a model where the data from that one customer that I am allowed to collect data from is used to provide data-driven insights to that customer. Then I use the entire customer base to generate insights and relevant information for individual customers. This is, for instance, where you can benchmark, help customers benchmark themselves against the overall customer base. And then finally, you have data for a secondary customer base. I think that that's an interesting one. I believe that in the future, in the coming 10 years, we will see situations where many of the companies in Software Center will start to generate data in their products in the field that is not relevant for the product itself. It's not relevant for the primary customer. I am just generating that data so I can serve another stakeholder with that information. Finally is the AI, machine learning and deep learning dimension, which many of you are of course talking about these days. But we go from data for human interpretation to static machine learning, AI integrated into Devops, then mass customization. One of the big things that you can do with federated reinforcement learning is that you can move towards mass customization. And then finally, we believe that one of the other things that will happen in the coming 10 years is a situation where systems will fully autonomously experiment with their own behavior without any human involvement. We've had a beautiful case at one of the companies in Software Center where one of their customers was complaining that once I put my product in operation at a particular location, it performs equally well after 2 seconds, 2 minutes, 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months and 2 years. Why doesn't it get better as it sits there? And I think that that's one of the big questions that we're going to be seeing. Why doesn't my car learn from, or in my case, my motorcycle, I came here by motorcycle this morning, why doesn't my motorcycle learn from what my preferred behavior is and adjust itself to that? What I wanted to do before wrapping up and letting Eric in is I wanted to once again thank the founding members of Software Center. I already mentioned them: Ericsson, Saab, Albe, Volvo and Volvo Cars. I know that I shouldn't show those 2 logos, but I don't know how to separate the 2 companies, as well as University of Gothenburg and our hosting institution, Chalmers. If you 6 partners had not taken the gamble to start Software Center, none of the others would have joined, and we would be in a very different situation today. So I'm very grateful for all of you, for the companies and the leaders behind that 10 or 11 years ago agreed to start Software Center. And I know that one of the people, and I don't want to mention too many names, but Anders Gaspar is one of the people that has been involved from the beginning. I wanted to do a little of a pre-announcement somewhere during this year. We are currently working on it. There will be a book to celebrate the 10 years of Software Center, where we're going to be providing some new material as well as republishing what we believe are the most impactful papers that we have collected over the last 10 years. This will be edited by the 5 theme leaders that we have today. So that's Jan Carlsen, Helena Holmström Olsen, Christian Sandahl, and Miroslav Staron. Stay tuned for that. We hope to announce that in the December reporting workshop. And with that, I want to move towards the program. Just to give you a quick overview, I was last night when I was on the plane flying back from Stockholm, emailing back and forth with Eric to suggest that perhaps he could start a little bit earlier, because I believe that his information is much more relevant than me. But that is next on the agenda. At 11 to 12, we have community updates, where we have 3 parallel sessions. You can find the links on the Software Center website or in the email that Malin sent to you yesterday, or if you registered very late this morning. There is a software engineering track where 3 of the theme leaders, Miroslav, Jan Carlsen and Christian, and then of course Wilhelm is involved there as well, are running the software engineering community session. Helena will host the product management session, and I will be hosting the AI engineering session. And if you look at the website, you will see that I cannot quite remember what was in the software engineering session, but I know that in product management, Anders Guts from Access Communications will be giving a presentation. And in my case, it is Mikael from Scania in the AI engineering track, who will talk about how Scania works with developing all kinds of solutions for autonomous drive. We have a lunch break between 12 and 11. Then we move towards the themes. We have 5 parallel tracks going on between 1 and 3. Where we have continuous delivery, theme 1, run by Christian Sandahl, architecture run by Jan Carlsen, metrics run by Miroslav, custom data and ecosystem driven development by Helena, and then I will run the AI engineering track. And there we basically give you an insight into what is happening in the projects within each of the themes that we have ongoing. And then at the 3:15 we have a closing keynote from Sara Mazur, who was also instrumental in the beginning of Software Center, because at that time she was heading Ericsson Research. But today she is Director Strategic Research at Knut and Alice Wallenberg Foundation, as well as chair of the WASP program. And then finally, around 3:45, after Sara has given her presentation, we finish the Q&A. We will have a little bit of a discussion about what are next steps within Software Center, and I'd love to have some of your input on that. That brings me to where I would like to announce or introduce our next opening keynote. I'm not sure if, I hope Eric is online. Maybe you stop sharing the screen.